A father spent 2 years saving to give his son 5 machines and a clean start. His son spent 8 months building something to give his father peace of mind. Neither knew what the other was doing. And it took a John Deere dealer showing up on a Saturday morning to put both halves of the story in the same room. It was a Monday morning in October of 2021, and Vernon Holt was sitting at the desk in the small office off the kitchen of the farmhouse outside Aledo, Illinois, where he had been making farming decisions for 43 years, sitting with the Case IH sales materials that Margaret Ohl had sent him in September, and the financial calculations he had been running since August on the legal pad beside them. And Vernon was 67 years old and had been planning this specific morning for 2 years without telling anyone, not Ruth and not Curtis and not the neighboring farmers he talked to at the elevator, and not anyone. Because the planning had been the private project of a man who understood that gifts of this size and this significance are not plans you share before they are complete, because sharing them before they are complete introduces other people's opinions into a process that belongs entirely to the person executing it, and that other people's opinions therefore cannot improve and can only complicate. And Vernon had executed the planning alone across 2 years with the focused patience of a man who has a clear objective and a clear timeline, and who does not require external validation to maintain either. The objective had been clear since the morning in October of 2019 when Curtis had come to Vernon after the harvest and said, "Dad, I want to talk about the operation's future." And Vernon had listened to his son lay out his thinking about the farm's direction and the equipment needs and the financial structure that a full handover would require. And what Vernon had heard underneath Curtis's careful, practical presentation was the thing a father hears when his son talks about the future of the farm his father built, which was not the financial analysis and not the equipment assessment, but the specific quality of commitment in the voice of a 32-year-old man who has spent 12 years working ground he loves and who is ready to carry it forward if the terms of the carrying are ones he can sustain. And Vernon had listened to all of it and said, "Let me think about it." And Curtis had said, "Take your time." And Vernon had said, "I will," and had begun the 2-year plan the following week without telling Curtis that the thinking was already done and the planning had already started. The Case IH decision had not been the original plan, and Vernon had spent the first year of the 2-year planning period assuming the handover fleet would be John Deere, because Vernon had been buying John Deere from Boyd Stemmer's dealership in Aledo for 19 years, and the relationship between a farmer and a dealership that has served him for 19 years carries the specific inertia of something that has worked adequately and that therefore requires a positive reason to change rather than merely the absence of a reason to continue. And the positive reason arrived in the spring of 2020 when Vernon's 2017 John Deere 8370R went down during planting with a software fault that Boyd's dealership had a 16-day service window to address, and that cost Vernon 11 days of planting season and $4,200 in emergency costs, and that Boyd had handled with the professional competence that a dealership handles things when it is doing everything correctly within a system that is itself the problem. And Vernon had sat with the 16-day window and the 11 lost days and the $4,200 and had run the calculation that every farmer eventually runs when a service failure during a critical window produces costs that exceed what the warranty structure and the dealer relationship can absorb, which was the calculation of what the next 19 years looked like if the service architecture continued its current trajectory. And the calculation had produced a number that changed the plan from John Deere to Case IH between the spring of 2020 and the summer of 2020, and that Vernon had confirmed across 18 months of independent research into Case IH's service model and dealer network and equipment performance before calling Margaret Ohl in September of 2021 and requesting the sales materials that were now on the desk beside the legal pad. Vernon picked up the phone at 9 o'clock on Monday, October 11th, and called Margaret and said, "Margaret, I'm ready to place the order." And Margaret said, "Mr. Holt, I'm glad to hear that." And Vernon said, "5 machines, the configuration we discussed in September." And Margaret said, "The Magnum 380, the Magnum 310, the 2 Maxim 145s, and the Farmall 110A." And Vernon said, "That's correct." And Margaret said, "Delivery timeline is 12 to 14 weeks from order confirmation, so February at the latest." And Vernon said, "That works. Curtis takes over the operation in March. I want the machines there before he starts." And Margaret said, "I'll have the order confirmation to you this afternoon." And Vernon said, "Thank you, Margaret," and hung up and sat at the desk for a moment with the legal pad and the 2 years of planning behind him, and felt the specific, settled satisfaction of a man who has completed the preparation for something and is now simply waiting for the something to arrive. And then he went to the kitchen where Ruth was making coffee and said, "I placed the order." And Ruth turned from the counter and looked at him and said, "The Case IH?" And Vernon said, "5 machines, delivered before March." And Ruth said, "You're going to tell Curtis." And Vernon said, "In March, when the machines are there." And Ruth said, "Vernon." And Vernon said, "Ruth, I want him to see them, not hear about them. There's a difference." And Ruth looked at her husband for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has been married to a man for 42 years and who knows when his stubbornness is productive and when it is simply stubbornness, and said, "Tell him before March." And Vernon said, "After delivery." And Ruth said, "You're impossible." And Vernon said, "I know," and poured his coffee and went back to his office. And Curtis was in the equipment shed 40 feet away, servicing the combine after harvest, with no knowledge that 5 Case IH machines had just been ordered in his name, and that the 2 years his father had spent planning them were the same 2 years Curtis had been spending on something else entirely. Curtis Holt had begun talking to Boyd Stemmer in February of 2021, 8 months before his father placed the Case IH order, and the conversation had started the way conversations start when a younger person decides to address a problem that an older person has been living with long enough that the living with it has become indistinguishable from accepting it, which is carefully and without announcing itself as the conversation it actually is. And Curtis had called Boyd on a Thursday morning in February and said, "Boyd, I want to talk to you about the service arrangement on our operation." And Boyd had said, "Is there a specific issue?" And Curtis had said, "There's a structural issue that's been building for a few years, and I want to address it before I take over the operation from my father." And Boyd had said, "When are you taking over?" And Curtis had said, "March of next year, roughly." And Boyd had said, "Come in and let's talk." And Curtis had driven to Boyd Stemmer's dealership in Aledo on the following Tuesday and sat across the desk from a man he had known since he was 14 years old and said, "Boyd, my father has been your customer for 19 years, and in those 19 years, the service architecture has changed in ways that are going to make the next 19 years significantly more expensive than the last 19. And Boyd had looked at him and said, "You've been reading the industry publications." And Curtis had said, "I've been watching what happens to our operation every time we need service during a critical window." And Boyd had said, "The 2020 planting season?" And Curtis had said, 16 days, Boyd, 11 lost planting days and $4,200 in costs on a machine under extended warranty. And Boyd had said, "I know." And Curtis had said, "That's not a dealership failure. I understand that. It's a system failure. The authorized service architecture has a capacity problem that produces exactly that outcome for exactly the operations that can least afford it." And Boyd had looked at his desk and said, "What do you want?" And Curtis had said, "I want to talk about whether there's an arrangement that addresses the structural problem before it defines the next 2 decades of our operation." And Boyd had said, "What kind of arrangement?" And Curtis had said, "I've been thinking about that for 6 months, and I have some specific ideas if you're willing to hear them." What Curtis had been thinking about for 6 months was not a complaint and not a threat to switch brands, and not the kind of customer pressure conversation that dealerships receive and manage with the professional detachment of institutions that have heard the conversation before, but a genuine structural proposal, the product of 6 months of careful thinking by a 34-year-old farmer who had grown up watching his father navigate the gap between what John Deere's service architecture promised and what it delivered during the moments that mattered most, and who had decided that the gap was not going to define his operation if there was a conversation available that could address it honestly. And the proposal Curtis laid out for Boyd Stemmer on the Tuesday morning in February had 3 components that Boyd had not heard combined in that specific way from any customer in 26 years of dealership operation. The first being a 10-year service commitment from the Holt operation covering all warranty and scheduled maintenance exclusively through Boyd's dealership in exchange for priority scheduling that guaranteed a maximum 72-hour service window during planting and harvest. The second being a locked labor rate for the 10-year term indexed to a specific inflation measure rather than the dealership's annual rate review. And the third being an independent diagnostic access provision that allowed a qualified independent mechanic to to perform non-warranty repairs on Holt equipment without triggering compliance flags or service tier reclassification. And Boyd had listened to all three components and said, "Curtis, where did you develop this?" And Curtis had said, "I've been reading contract structures in the agricultural equipment industry for 6 months and talking to farmers in 3 counties about what they wish their service arrangements contained and building something from that." And Boyd had said, "This is a serious proposal." And Curtis had said, "I'm a serious person, Boyd." And Boyd had looked at the proposal and said, "I need to think about this." And Curtis had said, "Take your time. I have until March of next year." And Boyd had said, "I'll come back to you in 2 weeks." And had come back in 2 weeks with questions, and Curtis had answered the questions, and Boyd had come back again with more questions, and Curtis had answered those too. And the conversation had been proceeding across 8 months with the patient thoroughness of 2 people who are building something that requires getting right rather than getting done. And by October of 2021, Boyd and Curtis were 2 weeks from finalizing the arrangement when Vernon Holt called Margaret Alley on Monday morning and ordered 5 Case IH machines. Boyd found out on Wednesday, October 13th, when his Case IH counterpart in the regional dealer network sent him a courtesy notification that a long-term John Deere customer in his territory had placed a 5-machine order. A professional courtesy that dealers extended to each other in the Mercer County market when a significant account moved, because the county's farming community was small enough that significant account movements affected the entire dealer ecosystem, and dealers who knew about them in advance could plan accordingly. And Boyd looked at the notification and saw Vernon Holt's name and felt the specific combination of professional alarm and personal discomfort of a man who has just received information that is simultaneously a business problem and a human problem, and who cannot address the business problem without first addressing the human one. And Boyd sat in his dealership office for a long time with the notification on his desk and thought about 19 years of Vernon Holt's business and 8 months of Curtis Holt's proposal, and the 2-week timeline to finalization that the 5-machine Case IH order had just made significantly more complicated. And then he thought about what Curtis did not know, which was that his father had placed the order, and what Vernon did not know, which was what his son had been building for 8 months. And Boyd understood that he was the only person in Mercer County who held both pieces of information simultaneously, and that holding both pieces without bringing them together was not something he could do in good conscience, and Boyd Stemmer was a man for whom good conscience was not a professional category, but a personal one, had been that kind of man for 58 years, and was not going to stop being that kind of man because the situation was complicated. And on Thursday evening he called Curtis and said, "Curtis, I need to come out to the farm on Saturday morning." And Curtis said, "Is there a problem with the arrangement?" And Boyd said, "There's something I need to tell you and your father together." And Curtis said, "My father doesn't know about the arrangement, Boyd. We discussed that." And Boyd said, "I know." And Curtis said, "Then why?" And Boyd said, "Because your father does something on Monday that you don't know about, and I need to be in that room when you both find out what the other has been doing." And Curtis was quiet for a moment and said, "What did my father do?" And Boyd said, "Saturday morning, Curtis, 9 o'clock." And Curtis said nothing further because the quality of Boyd Stemmer's voice told him that Saturday morning at 9 o'clock was not a conversation to preview on a Thursday evening phone call, but one to have in person with everyone present. And Curtis hung up and went back to his work and said nothing to Vernon and nothing to Ruth, and waited for Saturday the way people wait for things they cannot accelerate and cannot avoid, which is with the specific patience of someone who has done what they can do and must now allow the situation to complete itself. Saturday, October 16th arrived the way important days arrive on working farms, without ceremony and without any atmospheric acknowledgement of its significance. An October morning in Mercer County, Illinois, that was cold enough for jackets and clear enough to see the full width of the fields from the farmhouse porch, and that asked of the people on the Holt farm the same things it asked of every other farm in the county, which was to be present and attentive and ready for whatever the day required.
and Vernon was in his equipment shed at 7 doing the Saturday maintenance checks he always did, and Curtis was in the adjacent shed servicing the combine header with the focused attention of a man who is doing physical work while his mind is somewhere else. And Ruth was in the kitchen and knew Boyd Stemmer was coming at 9 because Curtis had told her Friday evening without explaining why. And Ruth had looked at Curtis and said, "Does your father know Boyd is coming?" And Curtis had said, "Not yet." And Ruth had said, "Tell him tonight." And Curtis said, "Boyd asked me not to." And Ruth had looked at her son with the expression of a woman who has spent 42 years married to a man who does not share plans before they are complete, and who has now produced a son with the same tendency, and who finds the tendency simultaneously understandable and exhausting, and said, "This family." And Curtis had said, "I know." And Ruth had gone back to her kitchen and waited for Saturday the way she had been waiting for things in this family for 42 years, which was with the patient resignation of a woman who loves the people she is waiting on and has made her peace with the fact that they will always make her wait. Boyd Stemmer pulled into the Holt driveway at 8:58 and parked beside Vernon's truck and sat in his vehicle for a moment with the engine off, and the sitting had the quality of a man collecting himself before a conversation he has been preparing for since Thursday evening, and that he understands is going to be one of the most significant conversations he has in a farming career that has contained many significant conversations. And Boyd was 58 years old and had been selling John Deere equipment in Mercer County for 26 years, and had sat across from farmers in difficulty, and farmers in prosperity, and farmers at the end of their operations, and farmers at the beginning of them, and he understood the specific weight that family conversations carry when they happen in the context of a farm that one generation has built and another is preparing to inherit.
And he understood that what he was about to walk into was that kind of conversation, and that his role in it was the specific role of the person who holds the information that makes the conversation possible, which is not a comfortable role, and is not a role that 26 years of dealership operation had specifically prepared him for, but that the situation required, and that Boyd Stemmer's conscience had told him on Thursday evening he was not going to avoid. Vernon came out of the equipment shed when he heard Boyd's truck, and walked across the yard with the unhurried pace that was simply how Vernon moved, and said, "Boyd." And Boyd climbed out and said, "Vernon, good morning." And Vernon said, "Ruth said you were coming." And Boyd said, "I called Curtis Thursday evening. I wanted to talk to you both." And Vernon looked at Boyd and said, "Is there a problem with the equipment?" And Boyd said, "No equipment problem." And Vernon said, "Then what?" And Boyd said, "Can we go inside?" And Vernon looked at him for a moment and said, "Come in." And they went to the kitchen where Ruth was, and Curtis came in from the adjacent shed 2 minutes later, and the four of them sat at the kitchen table. Vernon and Ruth on one side, and Curtis on the other, and Boyd at the end. And the kitchen had the specific quality of a room that is about to contain something important, and that the people in it can feel is about to contain something important without knowing yet what that something is. Boyd put his hands flat on the table and looked at Vernon and then at Curtis and said, "I'm going to tell you both something, and I want you to hear all of it before either of you responds." And Vernon said, "Go ahead." And Curtis said nothing. And Boyd said, "Vernon, on Monday, October 11th, you placed an order for 5 Case IH machines through Margaret All's dealership." And Vernon looked at Boyd and said, "How do you know that?" And Boyd said, "Professional courtesy notification from the regional network." And Vernon said, "And you drove out here because of that?" And Boyd said, "Partly," and then looked at Curtis and said, "Curtis, in February of this year, you came to my dealership and proposed a 10-year service partnership arrangement covering the Holt operation." And Vernon turned and looked at his son, and Curtis looked at his father and said nothing. And Boyd said, "We have been developing that arrangement for 8 months, and we were 2 weeks from finalizing it when your father placed the Case IH order on Monday." And the kitchen was quiet in the specific way that kitchens are quiet when information has arrived that requires everyone in the room to recalibrate what they thought they understood about the people sitting beside them. And Vernon looked at Curtis for a long moment and said, "You've been talking to Boyd since February?" And Curtis said, "Yes." And Vernon said, "About a service arrangement?" And Curtis said, "A 10-year service partnership with a 72-hour guaranteed window during planting and harvest, and a locked labor rate and independent diagnostic access." And Vernon said, "Since February?" And Curtis said, "Since February." And Vernon said nothing further.
And the kitchen absorbed the specific silence of a father processing the information that his son has spent 8 months solving the problem the father spent 2 years trying to solve from a different direction. And Ruth Holt looked at Vernon and then at Curtis and said, "How long have you been planning the Case IH order?" And Vernon said, 2 years. And Ruth looked at her son and said, "And the service arrangement?" And Curtis said, 8 months. And Ruth said, "So you were both solving the same problem at the same time without knowing it?" And neither of them answered, because the answer was obvious, and Ruth Holt had never asked questions that required the obvious answers stated aloud. And Boyd sat at the end of the table and watched the room process what it had just received with the patient attention of a man who has delivered the information he drove out to deliver, and who is now simply present for what the information produces.
Vernon was the first to speak after Ruth's observation settled into the kitchen, and what he said was not what Boyd had expected him to say, and not what Curtis had expected him to say, and possibly not what Vernon himself had expected to say when he opened his mouth, which was, "Curtis, what are the specific terms of the arrangement?" said in the direct, practical voice of a man who processes unexpected information by moving immediately toward its operational implications rather than its emotional ones. And Curtis looked at his father and said, 10-year term, all warranty and scheduled maintenance exclusively through Boyd's dealership, guaranteed maximum 72-hour service window during planting and harvest windows, labor rate locked at current levels indexed to the agricultural equipment services component of the producer price index, and independent diagnostic access for non-warranty repairs without compliance flag or service tier reclassification. And Vernon looked at Boyd and said, "Those terms?" And Boyd said, "We've been working through the specific language for 8 months. The structure is sound, and I've had my attorney review the framework." And Vernon said, "And you were 2 weeks from signing?" And Boyd said, "Yes." And Vernon looked at the kitchen table for a moment and said, "And now the Case IH order changes that." And Boyd said, "The Case IH order changes the context, yes." And Vernon said, "How?" And Boyd said, "Vernon, a 10-year service partnership on John Deere equipment requires John Deere equipment to service. If the operation transitions to Case IH, the arrangement Curtis and I have been building doesn't apply to the new fleet." And Vernon said, "I understand that." And Boyd said, "I'm not here to argue against the Case IH order. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because I'm the only person who knew both halves of what was happening, and I couldn't sit in my dealership knowing what I knew without bringing it to this table." And Vernon looked at Boyd Stemmer for a long moment with the expression of a man assessing someone he has known for 19 years and finding in the assessment something he had known was there but had not recently examined, and said, "I appreciate that, Boyd," and meant it in the complete way that Vernon Holt meant things, without qualification and without the social padding that appreciation often carries when it is not entirely genuine. Curtis said, "Dad, why Case IH?" And Vernon looked at his son and said, "The 2020 planting season, 16 days. And Curtis said, "That's why I started talking to Boyd in February." And Vernon said, "I know that now." And Curtis said, "You were planning the Case IH order before February." And Vernon said, "Since October 2019. And Curtis said, "The morning I came to you after harvest and talked about the operation's future." And Vernon said, "Yes." And Curtis said, "You started planning that morning?" And Vernon said, "I had already thought about it. I needed to plan it." And Curtis looked at his father and said, "You told me to wait, and you were already planning." And Vernon said, "I told you to wait because the plan wasn't ready, and a plan that isn't ready isn't a plan, it's an intention." And Curtis said, "And the Case IH?" And Vernon said, "Was the plan for a clean handover, 5 machines, no debt, March delivery, operation ready for you to run on day 1 without the service problem I've been living with for 3 years." And Curtis said nothing for a moment, and Ruth looked at her coffee cup, and Boyd looked at the table, and the kitchen held the weight of 2 men who have each been carrying the same concern for the same person across overlapping timelines without knowing the other was carrying it. And the weight had the specific quality of something that is both moving and slightly absurd, the absurdity of 2 careful people being so careful about the same thing that their carefulness produced a collision neither of them anticipated. Vernon said, "What does the service arrangement actually solve, Boyd, specifically?" And Boyd said, "The 72-hour window solves the critical season problem. If your equipment goes down during planting or harvest, I have 48 hours to diagnose and 72 hours to have it operational. No exceptions, no queue. Your machine goes to the front regardless of what else is in the shop." And Vernon said, "And the labor rate?" And Boyd said, "Current rates locked for 10 years with the index provision. No annual review, no market adjustment. You know your service cost structure for a decade." And Vernon said, and the independent diagnostic? And Boyd said, this was Curtis's idea, and it was the right idea. It means Dale Hoffert or any qualified independent mechanic can connect to your equipment for non-warranty work without triggering a compliance sweep. Your service flexibility is preserved for the situations where my dealership's window isn't workable and you don't get penalized for using it. And Vernon looked at the window for a moment and said, that's what I was trying to solve with the Case IH order. And Boyd said, I know. And Vernon said, you're telling me Curtis solved it 8 months ago? And Boyd said, Curtis built a structure that addresses it, yes. And Vernon said, with John Deere equipment? And Boyd said, with the equipment you already own, the 8370R and the utility tractors and the combine, on terms that protect the operation for 10 years. And Vernon said, and the 5 Case IH machines? And Boyd said, are a separate question that I am not here to answer for you. And Vernon looked at Boyd and said, you're not going to sell me on staying with John Deere. And Boyd said, Vernon, I drove out here on a Saturday morning because your son spent 8 months building something for you without telling you, and I thought you deserved to know before the Case IH machines arrived in February and the arrangement Curtis built became irrelevant. I am not here to sell you anything. And Ruth looked up from her coffee cup and said, Boyd, in 26 years of selling my husband equipment, has anyone ever said that to him? And Boyd said, probably not. And Ruth said, then it means something. And the kitchen absorbed that observation with the quiet that observations earn when they are both accurate and unexpected. And Vernon looked at his son across the table, 34 years old and 12 years on the farm, and 8 months of patient, careful work building something for a father who was doing patient, careful work for him at the same time, and said, why didn't you tell me? And Curtis said, because I wanted it finished before you knew about it. I didn't want you making decisions about the handover based on a half-built arrangement. I wanted to hand you something complete. And Vernon said, I was trying to hand you something complete. And Curtis said, I know that now. And Vernon said, we were both waiting to hand each other something complete. And Curtis said, yes. And Vernon said, that's the most Holt thing I've ever heard. And something shifted in the kitchen at that, something in the quality of the air that the 4 people at the table all felt simultaneously, the shift that happens when tension that has been building toward a resolution finds the resolution and the room adjusts to the new condition. And Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, but was entirely Ruth. And Boyd Stemmer at the end of the table felt the shift and sat with it and said nothing, because nothing was the correct thing, and Boyd Stemmer had always known when nothing was correct. Vernon looked at the table for a long time after the shift settled into the kitchen and then looked at Boyd and said, Boyd, if I cancel the Case IH order and the operation stays with John Deere on Curtis's arrangement, what does the fleet situation look like? And Boyd said, your current fleet is in good operational condition. The 8370R has 3 years of useful life before it becomes a replacement conversation. The utility tractors are solid for 5 to 7 years. The combine is the newest machine you have. And Vernon said, and the 5 machines I was going to order? And Boyd said, the arrangement Curtis built doesn't require new machines. It covers the fleet you have on terms that protect the operation for 10 years. And Vernon said, so Curtis's arrangement solves the service problem without the capital outlay. And Boyd said, the arrangement solves the service problem. What you do with the capital is your decision. And Vernon looked at Curtis and said, how much did you know about the Case IH order? And Curtis said nothing until Boyd said it on Monday. And Vernon said, and if Boyd hadn't come out here Saturday, and Curtis said, I would have signed the arrangement in 2 weeks and found out about the machines in February when they arrived. And Vernon said, and then? And Curtis said, and then we would have had a more complicated version of this conversation with 5 Case IH machines in the driveway. And Vernon said, and the arrangement irrelevant? And Curtis said, yes. And Vernon said, Boyd? And Boyd said, yes. And Vernon said, why did you come? The honest reason, not the professional one. And Boyd looked at Vernon Holt across the kitchen table, a man he had sold equipment to for 19 years and whose operation he had watched Curtis grow into across the same period, and said, because your son spent 8 months building something for you that you didn't know about, and I have spent 26 years watching families hand farms from one generation to the next. And the handovers that go well are the ones where both people know what the other has been carrying. And the handovers that don't go well are the ones where one person finds out too late what the other had been building. And I didn't want that for your family. And Vernon said, even if it costs you the business? And Boyd said, Vernon, the arrangement Curtis built commits your operation to my dealership for 10 years. If you stay with John Deere, I don't lose the business. And Vernon said, and if I don't stay? And Boyd said, then I lose it. And I came anyway.
And the kitchen received that with the quiet it deserved, and Ruth looked at Boyd with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but something close to it. The expression of a woman who has spent 42 years watching men navigate difficult situations, and who recognizes when one of them has done it with genuine integrity rather than strategic calculation. Vernon said, "I need to talk to Curtis alone." And Boyd said, "Of course," and stood up, and Ruth stood up. And Ruth said, "I'll show you the garden, Boyd." And Boyd said, "I'd like that." And Ruth and Boyd went out the back door into the October morning, and Vernon and Curtis sat at the kitchen table alone for the first time in the conversation. And Vernon looked at his son and said, "Show me the arrangement." And Curtis went to his truck and came back with the folder he had been building for 8 months, the draft agreement and the supporting documentation and the notes from 8 months of conversations with Boyd, and set it on the table in front of his father. And Vernon read it the way Vernon read everything, completely and without rushing. And Curtis sat across from him and watched his father read and felt the specific feeling of a person who has built something carefully and is watching the person it was built for encounter it for the first time. The combination of vulnerability and certainty that careful work produces when it meets the person it was intended for. And Vernon read every page, and when he finished, he set the folder on the table and looked at his son and said, "The 72-hour window?" And Curtis said, "Non-negotiable from the beginning. I told Boyd in February that window was the floor and everything else was negotiable." And Vernon said, "The independent diagnostic provision." And Curtis said, "Your idea indirectly. I watched what happened in 2020 and I watched what happened to other farmers in the county with compliance flags, and I decided that any arrangement that didn't include independent access wasn't an arrangement worth having." And Vernon said, "And the 10-year term." And Curtis said, "Long enough to matter and short enough to renegotiate if the situation changes." And Vernon said, "Curtis?" And Curtis said, "Yes." And Vernon said, "This is better than what I was trying to build." And Curtis looked at his father and said nothing because the sentence required nothing from him except to receive it. And Vernon said, "The Case IH order solves a problem that this arrangement already solves." And Curtis said, "Yes." And Vernon said, "And the capital I was going to spend on 5 machines." And Curtis said, "Stays in the operation." And Vernon said, "Where it belongs when you're starting." And Curtis said, "Where it belongs." And Vernon looked at the folder and said, "I'm going to call Margaret Ohl on Monday and cancel the order." And Curtis said, "Are you sure?" And Vernon said, "I spent 2 years planning something for you and you spent 8 months building something better. Yes, I'm sure." And Curtis said, "The machines you have are good machines." And Vernon said, "The machines I have are good machines on an arrangement that makes them better. That's what you built." And Curtis said, "I built it for you." And Vernon said, "I know you did." And the kitchen was quiet with the specific quiet of a conversation that has said everything it needed to say and that both people in it can feel is complete. And Ruth and Boyd came back inside from the garden, and Ruth looked at the 2 men at the table and read in their expressions what the conversation had produced and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. And Boyd looked at the folder on the table and looked at Vernon, and Vernon said, "Boyd will sign the arrangement." And Boyd said, "I'll have the final documents ready by Wednesday." And Vernon said, "Curtis signs them. It's his operation." And Boyd looked at Curtis, and Curtis looked at his father and said, "I'll come to the dealership Wednesday morning." And Boyd said, "I'll be there," and shook Vernon's hand and shook Curtis's hand and said goodbye to Ruth and walked to his truck and drove out of the Holt driveway on the October morning and back toward El Agado and thought about 19 years of Vernon Holt's business and 8 months of Curtis Holt's careful work and the Saturday morning kitchen conversation that had put both halves of the story in the same room and produced the outcome that both halves had always been pointing toward without knowing the other half existed. And Vernon stood at the kitchen window and watched Boyd's truck turn onto the county road and said to Curtis, "Your grandfather handed this farm to me in 1978 and didn't tell me what he'd arranged with the bank until the morning of the handover." And Curtis said, "What had he arranged?" And Vernon said, "A 5-year operating line at terms the bank hadn't offered me when I'd applied myself. Your grandfather had been a customer there for 30 years and called in 30 years of relationship the week before the handover and never mentioned it until the papers were on the table." And Curtis said, "And you?" And Vernon said, "I spent 2 years planning 5 machines for a son who spent 8 months making the machines I already have good enough that 5 new ones weren't necessary." And Curtis said, "We're the same." And Vernon said, "We're the same," and turned from the window and said, "Come on, there's work to do." and Curtis followed his father out of the kitchen and into the October morning, and they went to their separate sheds and did the Saturday work that the farm required, and the October fields stretched away from the Holt farmhouse in the specific light of a mid-morning that had already contained more than most mornings contain, and that continued in the direction of afternoon with the indifference that good mornings and difficult mornings and mornings that change things all share, which is the indifference of time to what it carries and the patience of ground that has watched generations of the people who farm it build things for each other in the specific quiet way that people build things, when the building is the truest expression of what they feel and the thing they build is the only language adequate to say it.